Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment here once we see that the flow of participants entering the WebEx has slowed, but we'll plan to start in about a minute. All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is Zerai Hagos. I am the Deputy Director of the Office of Markets and Innovation here at the New York State Department of Public Service. And I'd like to welcome you to the first technical conference in the Grid of the Future proceeding, which was initiated by the Public Service Commission in April of this year. The overall mission of the Grid of the Future proceeding is to develop and maintain a plan that encourages investment in flexible resources, which can in turn lower future infrastructure and operating costs, improve system reliability, and ultimately lower utility bills and increase customer benefits for New Yorkers. The initiating order outlined 3 major phases of the proceeding with deliverables in 2024 and 2025. The first phase of the Grid of the Future proceeding, which is the primary focus of today's conference, is the Grid Flexibility Study, which will provide an assessment of the present and potential future capabilities of flexible resources in New York. The study will also identify recommendations to enable greater levels of grid flexibility. The second phase of the proceeding is the development of the first Grid of the Future plan, with a focus on recommended improvements to the Distributed System Implementation Plans, or DSIPs. The third phase of the proceeding is the second Grid of the Future plan, which builds upon the grid flexibility study we're talking about today and the first plan, and must address a number of key grid modernization elements, ranging from the establishment of deployment goals of flexible resources, the compensation structures for those resources, physical and cybersecurity, the enabling utility systems, and most importantly, identifying opportunities for customer savings. As I mentioned earlier, today's presentation will focus on the modeling approach and data assumptions we plan to use during the grid flexibility study in the first phase of the proceeding. Today's session is also an opportunity to hear directly from our partners at Brattle and DNV, who will be aiding staff with the development of the first phases of the Grid of the Future proceeding. Now, the Commission established aggressive timelines for the deliverables in this proceeding, and we hope that this and future technical conferences will provide stakeholders like you with visibility into the approaches staff and our partners are taking to develop the Grid of the Future plan. We also hope the technical conference will create opportunities for you to efficiently provide input into our work prior to us making filings. I'll close by thanking each of you for taking time on a Friday afternoon to engage in this technical conference. And Steffi, if I could ask you to advance the slide. Before I hand the meeting over to our first presenter, I just wanted to cover a few ground rules for today's meeting. First, we ask that you remain muted until called upon. Second, we expect that the material will raise questions throughout the presentation, and we've reserved 30 minutes at the end for Q&A following the prepared material we're going to present. We'll ask that you type questions into the chat window, and we'll address your questions in the order that they are received during the Q&A session. And if you're wondering about access to today's materials, we'll be posting slides and a recording of the meeting following today's technical conference on our Document Matter Management System, or DMM. And with that, I'll now hand the meeting over to our first presenter, Ryan Hledick of Brattle Group.
Great, thank you very much, Zerai, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Hledick. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I will be kicking things off for the Brattle DNV team, but you're going to be hearing from the other members of the team as well as we start to work through some of this material. We've got quite a bit to share with you during the first hour of the meeting, so we're just going to jump straight into it. We're going to start with quick team introductions to get you introduced to all of the key consultants that are supporting DPS in this initiative. I'll give a quick overview of the project, phase one, the potential study, and kind of how we're approaching it at a high level. Then you're going to hear from my colleagues, Akhilesh and Kate, a little more detail on specifically how we're modeling the value of grid flexibility, some of the assumptions and techniques that we're using there. Then you'll hear from the DNV team a little more on some of the key data sources that we're using, how we're leveraging data that is New York specific as much as possible. Give you a quick overview of next steps and where we go from here. And then, as Zerai mentioned, we're reserving 30 minutes at the end to address as many questions as possible as are coming into the chat. So just to start quickly with team introductions, I'll go first, then I'll hand it to Brattle, and then we'll pass it to DNV. Like I said, Ryan Hledick, I'm a principal with Brattle. I've been with Brattle for about 18 years, and a focus of my consulting practice throughout those 18 years has been grid flexibility. When I started, we called it demand response. Then I think we started calling it demand flexibility. Now we call it virtual power plants. We call it grid flexibility. Personally, I don't care what we call it. If we're talking about trying to advance our thinking about how we make customers more flexible consumers of energy in a way that reduces the overall costs and improves the reliability of providing power, I think it's a great topic. So that's a quick background on me. Akhilesh, why don't I let you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Ryan. Akhilesh Ramakrishnan, Managing Associate in our Toronto office. I'll be the Brattle Project Manager for this effort. And I've been with Brattle a bit over 3 years now. And most of my work is mainly focused on electrification and DER planning. Kate?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Peters. I'll be the modeling lead on this project and work very closely with Akhilesh and Ryan on a lot of the VPP and distributed energy resources modeling at Brattle. Kelly, I'll hand it over to you.
Yep. Hi, I'm Kelly Marin. I'm a principal consultant at DNV. I will be the project manager for DNV side. I've been in the industry for about 20 years, both on the utility side and for about the past 15 years as a consultant. Similar to Ryan, my background has been very focused on demand response, both on the impact evaluation side, potential assessment, and then also supporting program planning. I'll go ahead and introduce Teague as well, since she's not able to be with us today, but you'll be hearing more from her as we move into phase two. She's a senior consultant. She's got about 10 years of industry experience. She's also been focused on flexibility and demand response. And she brings a background that's a mix of both consulting and implementation. And she will be the DSIP assessment lead for our team. Nick, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, hey everyone. My name is Nick Poswatz. I'm the market characterization lead for DNV. I've been with DNV for about 4 years now. My background is, I'd say, a mix of what everyone previously talked about, with kind of a focus on, market characterization of demand response and other things, DERs, and then resource adoption forecasting as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks everyone. So you'll notice when you look at the slide, we have all major US time zones covered with this project team. So we are virtually working around the clock on the grid flexibility study. Okay, so now we'll jump into some of the more technical materials, starting with an overview of the project. Zerai already gave you a sense of the 3 phases. We'll add a little more detail to that from our perspective. So phase 1 is the grid flexibility potential study. This is really a quantitative assessment of the cost-effective achievable potential for grid flexibility. But we don't want to just stop with an estimate of what the potential is. we're going to drill down and on a more qualitative level, identify the barriers that could prevent us from reaching that potential fully, and also identify options for addressing the barriers. So the outcome of this first phase, as I said, will be the grid flexibility study report that summarizes all of that information. Phase 2 is that first iteration of the grid of the future plan. And this is, again, really focused on the utility DSIPs. So this will involve a review of the utilities' most recent DSIPs relative to a prioritized list of elements for evaluating the DSIPs. It will also include an update to DSIP guidance for the utilities that we'll be developing in coordination with DPS. And then the outcome of this second phase, again, as I mentioned, is that first iteration of the Grid of the Future plan, which will really summarize those deliverables. And DNV, Brattle is primarily leading phase 1, DNV is primarily leading phase 2, and then longer term, as I said, there will also be phase 3, the second iteration of the Grid of the Future plan, which is really about establishing this long-term vision for grid flexibility in New York, developing a detailed roadmap for realizing that vision, and then setting this up as a framework that can be updated over time as conditions evolve on the power grid. So that will involve, the outcome of that third phase is a second iteration of the Grid of the Future plan. Today, as we've discussed, we are focusing exclusively on phase 1, the grid flexibility potential study, and there will be subsequent stakeholder meetings where we'll get into some of the other material. So the grid flexibility potential study, we'll just start with study objectives. What do we want to accomplish with this potential study? We want to create awareness and understanding of the untapped opportunity for grid flexibility potential in New York. I think where we are with the study currently, we're certainly anticipating that there are opportunities out there that aren't yet being made actionable yet today. We're also going to the plan is to develop realistic potential estimates that are really grounded in observed performance of these types of programs and enrollment in these types of programs from other jurisdictions. There's sometimes a tendency for potential studies to be very theoretical, and our approach to a study like this is to ground all of our estimates in the types of impacts and types of participation levels that we have seen being achieved in very successful utility programs offered in various jurisdictions, primarily across North America. The analysis won't just result in a high-level estimate of, say, statewide potential. It's also going to allow us to drill down and identify the specific programs or technologies that are, essentially the low-hanging fruit that provide the largest and most cost-effective potential. And then lastly, like I was saying earlier, we don't want to just end with, consultants saying, there's all this potential out there, now go ahead and figure out how to take advantage of it. We want to make the potential study actionable. And so we're going to do that by relating our potential estimates to key activities that are necessary to achieve that potential. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Just a few quick comments on analysis scope. So we're focused on 2 years, 2030 and 2040. So we'll have sort of a midterm and longer term view. The geographic granularity at which we're collecting data and conducting the analysis is each major IOU in New York, plus PSEG Long Island. For customer segments, we're looking at residential, small C&I, and large C&I. The analysis also will include consideration for disadvantaged communities. Data granularity there isn't quite as robust as we have for the 3 customer segments that are listed on the slide, but we're going to include some analysis and discussion of that specific customer segment as well. And then lastly, in terms of the programs and technologies that are being considered, we're really looking at all practical behind-the-meter options that are available. We're going to get into the specifics in a couple slides, but the key takeaway here is the scope of our analysis is focused on behind-the-meter resources. Front-of-meter distribution-connected resources, I think, could be considered part of the broader scope of the Grid of the Future proceeding, but the potential study is really looking at behind-the-meter options, which tend to be the primary focus of this initiative. So now I just want to give you a better sense of how we're going to be thinking about the potential. So the chart that we're looking at on this slide is just a conceptual illustration of what New York's grid flexibility potential could be out to 2040, with the vertical axis being megawatts of demand reduction capability. But what we're going to try and drill down on in this analysis is how you get there. So just to break this chart down, the bottom gray hashed section of the chart, that represents the existing grid flexibility capability that already exists in New York today. And we do have an expectation looking out over the next decade and a half that that capability will naturally or organically grow even under a business as usual scenario, because we do anticipate that utilities and aggregators will continue with the full-scale programs that exist today. And there likely could be some, just organic, modest increase in participation due to growth in the customer base, growth in the adoption of new technologies, and overall experience with these programs. So that's the gray section. But then there are a number of actions that could be taken to increase that capability further. The first is introducing new programs. That could mean scaling some of the offerings like EV managed charging programs or battery programs that are really in the pilot phase today. Or it could mean, for example, in the long run, a transition to default time of use rates. So we will be looking at the potential associated with new programs that aren't offered at scale today. You also can increase potential by improving the economics of the programs. There are two ways to do that. The first is allowing the programs to more fully capture and monetize the value that they're able to provide to the power grid. So this involves really full consideration of the value stack that's associated with grid flexibility. So that's how you improve kind of the monetizable benefits of these programs. On the cost side, you can also improve the economics of these programs by reducing program costs. And that potentially could happen through those cost declines could happen through improvements in efficiency and scale and other approaches that would reduce the overall cost of going out and implementing a new grid flexibility program. And then the last consideration that we think really could drive this potential estimate is improvements in the way we engage customers in these programs. What are the models that could be considered in the future that will make these programs more attractive to potential participants than they are today? And with our modeling, we're going to be drilling down and really trying to develop a quantitative estimate of how each of these contributors could lead to the total potential, quantitative potential estimate that we develop for New York. So that's kind of the initial breakdown of the potential. But then if you think about it, there's still a lot more detail that we're going to need to consider behind each of those colorful segments of the chart. So the table that you're looking at is describing specific actions, just again, hypothetical at this point, specific actions that could be taken to contribute to that potential. Each of the rows of this table is one of those sections of the potential chart that we were just looking at. And then the columns of the table are specific actions that would be needed to provide that contribution. So if we focus on, for example, just the first row of this table, that first portion of the chart that was associated with introducing new grid flexibility programs in the state. There are probably some actions that would need to be taken, things that would need to happen in order for that to be possible. One might be better device interoperability, better ability to communicate with and control various end uses on the customer side of the meter. Another action might be more R&D funding that's available to really promote the type of innovation that's needed to develop these new programs. So we're going to be going through and really developing for the potential study a list a prioritized list of these actions that we think could be the top contributors to achieving potential across the state. And we're doing that through a series of expert interviews that we've begun and are continuing to conduct, where we're really focused with, on talking with the market participants, the companies that are on the ground, trying to make this happen today, to develop a better understanding of what are the barriers that they're bumping up against and what do they view as the most important solutions for overcoming those barriers. So I'll spend a minute just talking about the programs that we're going to be including. First category is programs related to heating and cooling. So we'll be considering smart thermostat based heating and cooling control for the mass market, residential and small C&I customers. We're also going to be looking at the ability to manage electric water heating, including heat pumps. We'll be considering a number of options for managing electric vehicle load, given how significant of a role electric vehicle adoption could play in New York's long-term energy outlook. Time of use rates for electric vehicles, managed charging at the home and at the workplace. There will be considerations in our study for vehicle to grid capability. And then also there will be some modeling around managed charging for medium and heavy duty vehicles. We'll be modeling a couple different options for large commercial and industrial customers. One is an interruptible tariff, which is really more of the tariff-based, more manual option for managing load, but then also a more advanced form, AutoDR, automated demand response, that focuses on varying degrees of automated response from major end uses at larger commercial and industrial facilities. And then lastly, we have the other category. This will include options for using behind-the-meter batteries to provide grid services, as well as options like time varying rates or time of use rates that could be offered to the mass market to encourage more behavioral response, behavioral load shifting for any customer, regardless of whether they own a specific technology or not. So when you add that up, I think they're, looking across the 3 customer segments, there are about 15 different measures or programs that we're going to be modeling in the context of this study. So I'll just present one more slide here. You're going to hear more from Kate and Akhilesh on the details of our modeling approach. Just want to give you kind of a high-level view of some of the features that will be included in that modeling that are really critical when it comes to thinking about how we represent grid flexibility in an analysis like this. So the first is temporal granularity. Our analysis will have hourly granularity that will capture opportunities associated with load shifting and renewables integration. And really what we're saying there is this study, we're not just looking at, say, the capacity value associated with peak clipping. We're looking at a variety of grid services that could be provided from flexible end uses that might involve shifting that load or managing that load in a variety of ways. In order to do that, we need to have pretty granular representation of the time scales in the model. We're also going to account for value stacking. So, grid flexibility operations in our model are going to be simulated to maximize the total benefit of a given program or portfolio of programs across multiple value streams: generation, transmission, distribution, et cetera. Which is really, I think, how, when we think about resources at the grid edge, that is how they provide value, by being in a position to provide multiple different types of services to the grid. But when you're modeling that, you also need to account for trade-offs, right? If you're using a behind-the-meter battery to provide one service in one given hour, that might mean that you're foregoing providing a different service. And so our modeling accounts for some of those trade-offs. We also have pretty detailed representation of how these grid flexibility options are actually dispatched. These programs are unique, right? The opportunity that you have to manage a customer's heating through a smart thermostat is different, a different level of flexibility than you have if you're managing their electric water heating load, or a meter or a battery that's behind the meter, or an electric vehicle that's behind the meter and charging. So our modeling takes into account the unique characteristics and some of the limitations that we have on our ability to actually flex and control each of these given end uses. And then lastly, the point that we'll make is, the future is certainly uncertain, especially when you consider that we're looking out to 2040 with this analysis. So our analysis, as you'll see, includes will include pretty robust sensitivity cases to understand how really I think dependable our base case outlook is relative to different changes in the modeling assumptions. So that is where my initial comments will stop, and I will hand it over to Kate, who's going to talk more specifically about some of the details of our flexibility modeling.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So if you go to the next slide, the tool that we'll be using for this model is Brattle's in-house Flex model. And we'll be estimating the cost-effective potential of all of the different programs that Ryan just discussed. We've used this model in a various number of proceedings for different state commissions, other utilities throughout the US, and for different national labs and other organizations, and those are listed at the right. And I'm going to quickly just walk through the main methodology that we're taking for this modeling. The first steps to do this analysis is going to be to parameterize the programs. So we'll be modeling some of the existing programs like smart thermostats that utilities have today, but like Ryan mentioned, we'll be modeling a lot of new programs that the New York states and utilities have not enacted yet. So the first step for that is going to be to establish the different costs associated with running those programs, the different load flexibility potential for that program based off of the number of events and how customers are going to be able to shift load, and all of the different operational constraints associated with each of those programs. So that'll be step one. Then step two is going to be to establish the marginal costs, which will be all the benefits that dispatching these programs can provide to the grid. So like Ryan mentioned, there are many different value streams for demand response resources and at the different levels, whether it's the distribution grid, transmission, or from an energy or capacity perspective. And we'll be able to capture that and those different trade-offs in our flexibility model. Step three is going to be to take those different value streams and allocate those across an 8760 hourly avoided cost. In order to capture the different trade-offs that different hours and load reduction in those hours would contribute to the grid. Some hours may be very high energy price in terms of the system constraints, while other hours would see higher stress on the distribution grid. So we allocate those over an 8760 to get the hourly marginal costs at each of the different value streams that we're capturing in our model. And then step four is optimally dispatching our resources against those marginal costs. So we have our stacked profile of the different revenue streams based off of the benefits that these programs can provide. And we're able to simulate the hourly dispatch for each of the different programs and quantify the energy, capacity, and avoided transmission and distribution and other revenues that those programs are able to earn against the different cost metrics associated with running and operating the programs. And there we're able to get the cost-effective benefit cost ratios of each of the different programs for the 2030 and 2040 scenarios that we're modeling. And then in step five, what we're going to want to do is identify the cost-effective incentive and participation levels with an established relationship between incentive levels and participation from a customer perspective, which we've established based off of primary source data from other jurisdictions. We're able to increase or decrease the incentive in our model based off of, again, the benefit cost ratio from all those different value streams and adjust participation accordingly. At higher incentive levels, participants will be more willing to participate in events. And for programs that have very low incentive levels, that may not be enough to ensure customer enrollment and participation. And so all of that is happening in step five. And then step six is where we're estimating the incremental cost-effective potential for each of the utilities that we're modeling in this study. So we'll do this analysis at the utility level, and then for each individual program and each individual utility, we'll be able to get the estimate at the New York statewide in terms of the potential that we'll have from the various programs that we're modeling that's cost-effective in 2030 and 2040. So that's the high-level overview of the modeling approach, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on some of these individual components if we want to move to the next slide. So the first step in terms of characterizing the flexibility programs takes kind of three main inputs. The first one is looking at the per participant impacts that each of the programs will be able to deploy. And here we're relying on a lot of resources in terms of existing pilots and programs in the New York utilities currently today, in addition to other jurisdictions that have piloted some of these other new programs and additional studies as well. But here with these per participant impacts, we're trying to get a sense of, based off of actual data and not simulation, what reasonable load reduction assumptions there are from customer participation in these given programs. For some of them, they're more frequent programs throughout the year, and so we would expect less reduction on an event basis as opposed to more specific events. Then step 2 is thinking through program eligibility. Which customers are actually able to enroll in these programs? And that's really a function of the technology adoption that's required for program enrollment. Through 2030 and 2040, in order to comply with CLCPA targets and other New York goals, there's going to be a lot more adoption of electrification technology in the form of electric heating, electric vehicles, behind the meter storage, et cetera. And here we'll be forecasting how many customers will have these applicable devices and actually be able to enroll in these programs. Then the third input for parameterizing these programs is thinking through the participation inputs. Based off of a pretty extensive review of other DR potential studies and jurisdictional programs that have found cost-effective participation levels, we're going to be able to establish the first input of the participation estimates in terms of how many customers that actually are eligible to participate will enroll at a given incentive level. And so these participation inputs are base that will be then adjusting, as I described previously, based off of the cost effectiveness analysis of the program, which will vary by model year and utility based off of the different revenue streams. So from here, I'll turn it over to Akhilesh to go in a little bit more detail on the cost effectiveness approach that we're taking for this proceeding.
Thanks, Kate. So yeah, as Kate said, the cost effectiveness piece of this is really at the heart of how we determine load flexibility potential in this model. There is basically the approach is to figure out without the participation incentive, how cost effective each technology or program is, and that kind of tells us how much of an incentive can be provided to each technology. And that ultimately determines how much participation you can expect at that incentive level. And ultimately, that gets you to the kind of cost-effective potential level of each technology. And so cost-effectiveness analysis is basically, just two sides to the equation. One side is what we're seeing here, which is the costs that are added to deploy a certain program or technology to provide flexibility. Some of the costs we're looking at are the administrative costs of setting up and running a utility program, the incremental equipment cost for things like smart thermostats to actually be able to create the flexibility, labor and installation for any of these equipment types. And ultimately, the participation incentive is also a cost to get these devices out there. And then there is the second part of the equation, which is the benefits. And all of the benefits here are basically avoided utility system costs. And so those are going to be avoided energy procurement costs, avoided generation capacity costs, and reductions or deferrals of incremental transmission and distribution capacity investments. And so in the chart to the right, you can kind of see how all of these costs are allocated in the Flex model. What we do is we take hourly, some costs are already hourly, like energy, for example, is based on NYISO's wholesale market energy prices. Some of these costs are annual costs, and so we allocate them to the hours of the year where those costs are actually created. So for example, transmission capacity costs are going to be modeled as being avoided if a flexible resource can dispatch in some of the peak hours of the year to reduce the load on the transmission system. And so this chart basically just kind of provides a mock-up of when some of those costs can be shown in this model. And basically what happens in the model is we look at a flexible resource and see if, given its operational constraints, it can dispatch into some of these avoided cost time periods and how much basically total avoided cost it can create. So next slide. And one important thing to kind of dive deeper on here is the distribution capacity value, which is a bit more nuanced here because, well, for a few reasons. One is that for some of the utilities with really high distribution system costs and potentially more investments coming down the line as load grows, that's going to form a large kind of portion of the total value of deploying more demand flexibility. To the avoided distribution capacity is going to be kind of concentrated in certain locations on the utility system, and that's going to vary depending on how much capacity headroom different locations have right now, and kind of how the load growth is going to be dispersed across the distribution system in different locations. And finally, the kind of time periods in which the distribution system peak load occurs can be different in different parts of each network. It may or may not be aligned with when some of the kind of wholesale market costs are incurred. And so there's kind of a challenge there in terms of how you dispatch the demand side resources to be able to capture value from multiple parts of the value stack and make those trade-offs optimally. So next slide. And so how we're going to be looking at that distribution value approach is basically we're still going to be modeling it at each utility system level, but we're going to be doing kind of a fairly detailed look at each utility system. We're looking at their hosting capacity maps to see what portion of each utility's customer base is in locations that could be overloaded in the future as load grows. So we're going to be looking at kind of the system level load growth projection, applying it to different parts of the utility system, looking at kind of the current loading of different substations and where that loading is going to go in the future given load forecasts. And we're going to be looking at what percentage of customers are served at the substations where there could be overloads in the future. And basically, those locations are going to be the ones that have high distribution system kind of deferral or avoidance value. And so, it makes sense to provide higher incentives for demand flexibility there. And those resources are going to be more cost effective than the ones that are in locations where there's plenty of kind of spare distribution system capacity. With that, I'll hand it back to Kate to talk about where we're going to get the avoided cost data from.
Thanks, Akhilesh. Yeah, so all of the different inputs that we've just described are coming from various data sources, either from utility or other NYSERDA proceedings. And I think one thing to emphasize before I get into this is we're striving to be consistent across all of our data sources because we'll be forecasting a lot of customer adoption of technology, which will impact kind of system and utility load level data, which will therefore impact the marginal cost that could be benefit for the flexibility programs that we're modeling. So the main goal is to use kind of as most up-to-date data as possible that's consistent with other modeling efforts by either the utilities or the state, but really maintain consistency across the different utilities that we're capturing in this study, because again, we're reporting everything at the New York wide level. So to go into the system avoided costs in a little bit more detail, the first component is the energy price inputs. And so for that, we're using some of the revised integration analysis efforts that GE is modeling. And so those will be hourly marginal energy costs that we're going to get that are consistent with the scenario 2 strategic use of low carbon fuels scenario. And so we're using the revised case for that case for the 2040 cost, which will be removing the flexibility resources and slightly different from the public proceeding that's posted right now. And then for the 2030, we're using the gaps analysis from the baseline scenario 1 case consistent there. For the generation capacity costs, we're going to be using forecasted net cone values, again, based off of the integration analysis data for forecasted plant revenues and capital costs going forward into 2030 and 2040. And we'll be using a methodology similar to the methodology used in New York and other markets today, where we're going to be using the least cost net cone resource on a $1 per UCAP basis and be allocating that value over the top net load hours in order to capture kind of a proxy ELCC value for the resources that we're modeling. And then for the transmission capacity value, we'll be using that avoided transmission cost mostly from the utility 2018 MCOST studies with some changes based off of the utility coordination that we've used from there. And we're going to be allocating that annual transmission capacity value over the top system gross load hours for each of the different utility jurisdictions, again, in 2030 and 2040. And for the distribution capacity value, which Achilles just talked through in a little bit more specific detail, here we're going to be using the avoided distribution capacity costs that we're getting based off of the utility data requests that we've been coordinating with for this effort. And we'll be allocating those over the top system hours. And like Achilles mentioned in the previous section, we're only going to be attributing this distribution value to programs that would be located in those regions with values. So if you want to go to the next slide, I think one thing that we're certain is how uncertain the market will be in 2030 and 2040, given all the moving pieces on the customer adoption electrification front, and then the different supply side resources as well that would have a pretty big impact on the avoided costs that these VPPs and programs can earn. And so we're planning on running a pretty robust sensitivity case analysis in order to stress test kind of those key inputs and get a sense of what are the main drivers of the potential. So this chart on the right is from a prior Brattle study where we looked at California and the VPP potential there and highlights kind of the range of different scenarios that we tested. And we'll take a pretty similar approach in this proceeding as well, where we'll test high and low inputs for each of these different key inputs that we've just described, again, in order to get a robust sense of what's really driving potential, what are the really key uncertain factors, and we'll be able to highlight those in this proceeding. And so just to highlight, again, some of the key main inputs, we'll be testing some of the distribution and transmission cost assumptions that we're getting from utilities and how they'll change it by 2030 and 2040, in addition to sensitizing some of these avoided generation capacity costs, because who knows what will be the marginal resource by 2040 in a highly decarbonized New York State. We'll also be thinking through some of the more customer-specific assumptions, how eligibility will change based off of the rate that customers are adopting this electrification technology, and then also participation, how customers will be willing to participate based off of the incentives offered and other behavioral characteristics. We'll want to make sure we're capturing a range of options there. We'll also be looking at program-specific sensitivities as well, which will focus more on the operational characteristics. How many events are we going to be able to call a year? What are the per participant impacts going to be during those events? And then also cost as well. Costs will be pretty uncertain in terms of the future and how market competition can drive those down. From there, I think there's more detail in terms of the data sources, and I'll pass it over to the DNV team to continue on.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So in the next 2 slides, I'm going to discuss kind of the purpose, the overall purpose for performing the market characterization and kind of gathering data, and also kind of discuss the general approach to gathering this data, the different data sources, and our different approaches into filling some of the data gaps that came up throughout. And I should mention a more detailed kind of set of data descriptions, gaps, and sources is also available in the appendix. So overall, the kind of purpose of the market characterization is to provide, really a snapshot of kind of customers, energy use, and relevant programs and equipment. So quantifying kind of what customer populations currently look like, how customers use energy, and what types of appliances and technologies they currently have, and then how this will change over time given kind of changing market and policy drivers, and ultimately how energy use will change given the increasing saturation or change in saturation of electric equipment and different technologies such as EVs and energy storage. So ultimately, this is important in kind of identifying, as Kate mentioned on a prior slide, how many customers are eligible, based on what types of equipment they have, and then ultimately how much can that contribute to overall kind of grid flexibility. In this process, we've been working closely with individual utilities to characterize their individual systems because they know their systems and their customers best, and also have a significant amount of readily available data. Given this amount of data and the granularity, there were some gaps that we've had to fill with a variety of different New York specific kind of national level studies and data sources. And so I'd say some of these are within the kind of current market snapshot, but most relate to kind of future years in this analysis. So whether that's applying different data sources to extend forecasts through 2040, or just extending utility forecasts through 2040 based on growth rates, or applying kind of publicly available data sets, available forecasts for those kind of later years. We've identified different approaches depending on the gap that exists within the type of data. And additionally, given these data gaps, we've had to standardize some kind of categories of assumptions as well. And this really helps create kind of a uniform approach, kind of getting to a consistent statewide view, and definitely helps limit kind of favoring specific utilities or regions based on data availability and things like that. So that's a very basic overview of kind of the high level approach of how we're gathering the data. But now we'll discuss some of the individual data categories and how we're kind of gathering the data in different data sources in more detail. Thank you. So as mentioned prior, this market characterization is important in really creating a snapshot of utility customers, energy use, when that energy is used, and kind of what type of equipment is available now and in future analysis years. So we have two tables here that kind of summarize our data gathering approach to support the market characterization. And we've grouped kind of the overall types of data in the top table that we're gathering into these kind of 5 bins. And in this table, we've also identified how that data, how available that data was from utilities generally, some gaps, and then kind of identify the categories of data sources to fill those gaps in the table below. So I'll walk through the top table briefly. I'll walk through both tables briefly, but the top in more detail. So starting at the left, we're starting at the base level, looking at demographic data. That's basically gathering, identifying, customers, both counts and consumption, by segment and subsegment for residential. We did encounter some data gaps that we had to supplement with publicly available sources related to low income, single and multifamily splits, and then disadvantaged community customers as well. The next level up is saturation data. So looking at saturation of key end use equipment. So there were some gaps for kind of base year saturations from utilities, and then forecasted saturations for most utilities, or for all utilities. So this is another one where we had to fill in from NYSERDA stock and baseline assessments, and then additional kind of national sources as well to get to both kind of current year saturations and future year saturations throughout the forecast timeframe. Moving up one level, load shapes, both system and segment load shapes were pretty readily available throughout the utilities, so that there wasn't much of a challenge there. And additionally, moving up one more layer, when we get to kind of forecasted load shapes and also end-use load shapes, there was some data available by utilities, but there was also some supplementation there, given the kind of challenges in identifying future forecast load shapes. The kind of uniform or standardization approach was used here as well. And then finally, looking at kind of existing grid flexibility program data that was readily available from all utilities and used in kind of this market characterization. As I've kind of mentioned throughout, the 3 layers of kind of data sources that we're using when we don't have data or we had to fill in some gaps, there's quite a bit of New York specific sources. So as I mentioned, kind of residential stock and commercial baseline assessments, in recent years, information, kind of policy drivers and kind of forecasted install rates from the integration analysis. And then there's also not included here, but New York ISO system and resource outlook forecasts and Goldbook forecasts as well. Some of the national sources are pretty well known, REX and CBEX from EIA, Census, American Community Survey data to identify kind of different customer characteristics. And then for end use load shapes, NREL, ResStock, and Comstock data sets. And then we did some extrapolation, as I mentioned, of existing utilities data provided. So that's all I have on the kind of market characterization and data gathering approach. As I mentioned, there's additional details in the appendix.
Great. Thanks very much, Nick. So we just have one last quick slide on next steps, just to give everyone a sense of where we are going from here. As we mentioned at the beginning, there are going to be a few more technical conferences like this, just to keep everyone in the loop as we move forward with the studies. The next technical conference will be led by DNV, and that is going to be taking a look at the DSIP evaluation study methods that we'll be using as we really kind of start to dig into the DSIPs and also develop some of the guidance for DPS in terms of that evaluation process. Specific timing still TBD. We're targeting roughly about a month from now for everyone for that next conference. After that, we also plan on sharing the results of the potential study, the study we just discussed. So that'll be an opportunity for us not just to talk about assumptions and data, but actually to talk about what all this means in terms of results and the outlook that we've developed for New York as it relates to grid flexibility. So I think that's when things will get particularly exciting because we're going to start to have some really meaningful results to react to there. And then ultimately, as you know, phase 2 is building up to the first iteration of this Grid of the Future plan. We're planning there will be a technical conference to provide a review of that Grid of the Future plan. So those are 3 conferences that are in the works. There's some other outreach that's happening in parallel to that. When I was talking about barriers and solutions to grid flexibility, one of the things that I mentioned were some interviews that we're conducting with experts who are on the ground working to make all of this stuff happen. That is ongoing. I think we're probably about halfway through conducting those interviews. Those have been, fairly open-ended exploratory conversations where we're, spending about half the time trying to understand implementation barriers, and then half the time trying to understand, what key market participants view as being some of the attractive solutions to overcome those barriers. So far, those conversations have been extremely helpful for us to kind of identify the universe of possible solutions for making this stuff happen. What we would like to do once we have what I would call the raw material from those interviews is to develop a sense of priorities, right? What are those top barriers that everyone generally agrees are the most important barriers that we need to focus on and try and address with any future efforts? And then what are those solutions that stakeholders generally consider to be likely to have a particularly strong impact in addressing the barriers? And then also, to what extent do we consider those solutions to be feasible? And if we think about kind of the quadrant of options, to the extent that we can identify a set of solutions that are generally viewed to be both feasible and high impact, that's a really, interesting set of solutions for us to be focusing on and maybe building some future policies around. So we will be reaching out broadly to the stakeholder committee, the stakeholder community, those of you on this call with that survey to get your input on how you think about the prioritization of those barriers and solutions. So all of that is coming, so stay tuned for that. This is it for the formal part of our presentation. I've got to say this might be a new record. I rarely finish presentations ahead of schedule, but we have an extra 5 minutes relative to what we had budgeted for Q&A. We have, I guess, about 35 minutes set aside for Q&A. My understanding is a lot of questions have been coming in the chat. So at this point, my colleague Akhilesh is going to be facilitating some of the Q&A, and between Brattle, DNV, and DPS, we're going to do our best to address the questions that have been coming in through the chat.
Great. And yeah, and I'll generally prioritize the questions at the top of the chat, so the questions that were asked first. First question for Ryan, are community scale assets which are front of the meter within scope? And so that's the first question. I'll say I think there's been a few questions about how front of the meter assets are considered or whether they're considered. So if you could just give a general answer, I think that would be good.
Sure. Yeah, I think the general answer is, and I'll invite Zerai or anyone from DPS to weigh in on the broad scope of the Grid of the Future proceeding. As I understand it, front of meter distribution connected assets are a relevant consideration broadly in the Grid of the Future initiative. When it comes to the potential study, front of meter assets are not within the scope of the potential study. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is, my understanding is that the primary focus of the Grid of the Future proceeding is on trying to figure out how we get more flexibility from customers. And so focusing the potential study on that allows us to really focus on what I understand to be the core question of the Grid of the Future proceeding. And then in addition to that, from a more pragmatic standpoint, looking at the potential for front of meter resources, that's really a different study, right? Like when we're talking about what is the potential that we can get from customers as participants in the grid, we're looking at behavioral considerations related to participation. We're looking at economic considerations related to technology ownership, and then the ability and the willingness of customers to actually provide that flexibility in return for some type of incentive. That is a very different question than what I would consider to be essentially a detailed, granular distribution planning study that would need to be conducted to understand, the potential for cost-effective deployment of front-of-meter resources. So that is, I guess, my answer from the Brattle's perspective. But I think Zerai or anyone else from DPS, if there's anything that you'd like to add to that, please feel free.
Thanks, Ryan. I think that was spot on. And I see there are quite a few questions and comments about front of the meter. So I think we'll attempt to address all of those questions with this response. We don't have a lot of time, first of all, to carry out this flexibility study. We understand the objective of this flexibility potential study is ultimately to zoom in on barriers to unlocking greater levels of flexibility. And so we wanted to make sure this potential study used the best available information and at a very extremely high level quickly hones in on how we can unlock categories of new markets with policy changes. And so at the end of the day, it's going to be recommendations to make policy changes, tariff changes, programmatic investments that are the key insights that we're hoping to get to from this potential study. And so, we did a competitive procurement to evaluate different options to carry out the grid flexibility study. And we think we have really terrific partners who have a proven model for measuring this type of flexible resources like virtual power plants that I think were the most clear focus of the commission order. And as Ryan mentioned earlier in the presentation and just now, We think that recommendations that address other kinds of DER are totally in scope for the plan and the broader proceeding. We want to get feedback about policy changes that can encourage and unlock greater levels of penetration at all levels of the system. I'll also note that we have the coordinated grid planning process where the utilities are testing different levels of front of the meter penetration. There's one sensitivity that's a high DER sensitivity, and that study is happening in parallel to this grid flexibility study. Is it perfect? No, but we think that, that to Ryan's point, that type of system distribution level system planning analysis happens to more squarely fit into the type of analysis that's taking place in the coordinated grid planning process. And at the end of the day, we had to make some pragmatic decisions about how to get a study that was decision quality, prepared by the end of the year in 2024. And we think, we've made some trade-offs, but we think we've done the best we can on behalf of ratepayers and within the scope of the proceeding to put together a project that allows us to make some policy recommendations. So I can totally appreciate the desire to have different types of analysis and use cases sprinkled in here, but I feel pretty confident with the team we've assembled and the scope of this project, that we're going to be able to zoom in on some really important near-term recommendations and insights, which is, again, the key goal of this first phase. So invite I keep the comments coming in. We're going to capture all the written all the questions that have come into chat. We're gonna certainly think through them as we finalize the study, and feedback now. We have some contact information at the end of the meeting, and then written comments in response to the ultimate filing will all be taken into consideration by the commission.
All right. Thanks, Sarai. So next question is somewhat related. How do you define behind the meter, and is this proceeding inclusive of VDER compensated DERs?
We're defining behind the meter just high level as a customer sided resource that is sitting behind the customer's meter, so can serve that customer's load directly, or demand reduction itself, managing the customer's load through a smart thermostat or some other device like that. So that is the high level answer. And to the extent that those behind the meter resources, as I just defined it, are being compensated through the VDER tariff, then the answer to that question would be yes.
Could I also jump in? I know we've talked about this offline. We are looking at C&I use cases, and we are also using value stack as one of the ways to develop avoided cost. And so while you could argue we're representing customer sided resources, the economics of value stack in front of the meter certainly could abstractly apply to some of the types of resources that are in scope for this study. And directionally, I think the policy recommendations that might fall out of the quantitative analysis for those C&I use cases will be useful for front of the meter in addition to behind the meter. Again, it's not, we're not boiling the ocean here with the study, but I think there are ways that we can address these other use cases with the study that we have put together here.
Next question is, can this presentation be posted in the chat? Yes, I believe we'll post it on the website for everyone to be able to access. Okay, let me find the next question. Can you explain the extent to which you will be utilizing AI in the study and in the Flex model? If not, can you explain why not?
the Flex model, as we described, it has some bells and whistles for representing the dispatch of demand flexibility measures. It does not have AI incorporated into its analytical engine. And I think that's sufficient for this type of study, because really this is a screening exercise, right? We're trying to understand what is the low-hanging fruit, what are the big opportunities, and then more qualitatively, how do we make that happen? I think where I just thinking ahead, where I could see AI potentially playing a role is when there's a lot of, say, price forecasting uncertainty, and you're trying to decide how do we dispatch a behind the meter battery relative to that uncertainty in a way that sort of optimizes value. I think when you really start to get into like kind of the nitty-gritty details of monetizing the value of these assets in markets, I see that being a potentially useful tool there. At the screening level, where we can model, if we want perfect foresight into those prices, represent some degree of uncertainty into those prices. AI is not essential for getting to the point where we have a screening level result, which is what we're going for here.
Thanks, Ryan. And I also just wanted to acknowledge that we see there are also comments and recommendations in the chat, and we're noting those down, and we'll take them into consideration. But I'll just focus on the questions for the Q&A session. So are we, I think this was referring to a specific part of the presentation, but in general, are we referring to above market incentives or those that represent actual avoided cost?
The way the modeling works, I think Kate covered this pretty well, but the way the Flex model works is, we're basically, as our starting point, developing an estimate of what it costs to implement this program, right? And Akilah stepped through the different costs that we're considering, which really we're taking the utilities or the implementer's perspective on those costs, administration, marketing, to the extent that there are like incremental DERMS costs or some type of equipment cost associated with offering this program. Those are kind of the base implementation costs that get considered. And then the benefits are all of the avoided costs that we're estimating across the entire value stack, from energy and generation capacity down to local distribution investment deferral value. The difference between those two is the cost-effective incentive payment that you can offer to customers to enroll in this type of program. In our modeling, typically with a study like this, we'll make an assumption, which is I think pretty consistent with the way most utilities or aggregators would approach this, which is something a bit less than that full sort of remaining net value of the program is what you would make available to customers to participate. Because, say, from the utilities perspective, it's ideal if this program can benefit not just the participants, but actually benefit all ratepayers. And so by modifying the incentive payment in that way, you can actually make everyone better off through offering these programs. So that's analytically, that's the approach we take. And I think if I'm understanding the terminology in this question correctly, what that means is we are focused on incentive payment levels that are supported by the cost effectiveness of the programs. I think we could explore, and maybe this will get into one of the later questions, I think more qualitatively, we could explore more from a policy perspective, the potential opportunity or need that could be associated with richer incentives that could be available to certain customer segments like disadvantaged communities or low-income customers. If there's a view that an incentive of that level might be needed to draw those customers into the program and create this type of opportunity, while still allowing the program overall to be cost effective. So that would be, I think, a consideration that would be addressed more in the barriers and solutions and opportunities discussion than something that would be addressed through the quantitative modeling itself.
And then a kind of related question about the avoided costs, but I'll direct this one to Zerai. Is this redundant with the active marginal cost of service study proceeding, and will it use the NERA methodology?
I would say it's not redundant. I think this is ahead of the recent commission order on, I guess, revising the methodology for doing MCOS studies. And so I think I don't have the table handy, but effectively for some of the costs, we're using the 2018 vintage of the MCOS studies, and for others, for avoided distribution system values, help me out, Brattle, we're using basically a simplified approach of an MCOS study. So that was outlined in one of the tables in the presentations with the sources of those avoided distribution system cost values. And again, one is pointing directly to a 2018 vintage study, and the other is, basically us creating a simplified approach to those studies. And the new framework authorized by the commission, is going to result in a new future study. And again, we have to have this work completed by the end of the year, and so we had to draw the line with the best available sources for distribution system costs at the time of the start of this effort, and we've documented those decisions.
Yeah. How are we capturing grid operational constraints? I think that's a question for Ryan.
I might need more context
Yeah, I'm guessing it's a question about how, for our avoided distribution system value, we're capturing the ability of demand flexibility to meet all the constraints.
Well, I'll send that one back to you, Akhilesh, if you want to take a stab at that.
Sure. Yeah, I would say, I think we're doing a fairly high level, system level study here, and we're generally just looking at the capacity value of these resources. So we're going to be looking at, what portion of the system is overloaded, and generally how much load can be reduced in coincident periods, coincident peak periods, using these resources. And that's kind of going to be used as the proxy for how well demand flexibility can reduce peak loading. And we're going to be using the utility hosting capacity maps to identify where the constraints are and when they're going to occur based on the load forecasts. Okay, and then I guess moving on to a slightly different topic, still about avoided costs, but if we're looking at a 2030 horizon, why isn't avoided public health cost captured here?
Sure, and that maybe gets even more broadly into the question of how the societal cost of emissions, greenhouse gas or otherwise, is represented or not in the study. It's something we can give consideration to. I think what the primary focus of our analysis is on avoided resource costs, and really looking at this from the looking at cost effectiveness from this perspective of the utility or an aggregator that's going out and investing in these programs. Because ultimately what we're trying to do here is to put distributed energy resources and grid flexibility on a level playing field with supply side resources or conventional investments in the grid when it comes to making resource investment decisions, and trying to identify those opportunities for where grid flexibility is the most cost-effective, reliable option. Now, broader context, I think what is going to be driving a lot of those economics is New York's evolution toward a decarbonized grid. So in the background, what we're going to have is a lot of electrification of vehicles, of buildings, that will be driving the potential for grid flexibility. We're also going to be seeing the avoided costs that we're modeling, the energy costs, evolving in a way that is being driven by decarbonization of the power system as well. So decarbonization of the New York energy system is very much going to be driving the economic results of our modeling. The primary avoided costs that we're estimating are avoided resource costs. That said, two further comments, or three maybe. One is I do think, at least the RGGI costs will be reflected in the energy price. So to the extent that there's a cost of carbon baked into energy prices, that is something that will automatically be captured in our avoided energy costs. That's point number one. Point number two is, we can think about whether it would make sense to assign as a separate additional, source of value, an avoided social cost of carbon to the emissions reductions. Whether that's monetizable or not is another question, but we could potentially quantify that. But what the third point, which I would say in relation to that is, typically when at Brattle, when we have looked at the direct emissions reduction benefits associated with grid flexibility, those have been pretty modest, because typically what you're doing first of all, a lot of these programs typically are event limited, right? You can call maybe 10 or 15 events per year. It adds up to maybe 50 or 100 hours a year of demand reduction. That's typically not enough to really significantly move the needle on emissions. Programs that are doing more frequent, say daily load shifting, can have a more material emissions impact, but even then, it's often the case that you're shifting load from hours when you have slightly higher emissions on the margin to hours when you have slightly lower emissions on the margin. And it still doesn't typically lead to the same dramatic impact that you can have on greenhouse gas emissions that you could get from, say, an energy efficiency program or conversion from fossil fuel heating to electricity. So typically the direct benefit we haven't found to be really significant in a quantitative sense. There are indirect benefits, and actually RMI just put out a report, I think within the last week or two, that gets at this, and I think is pretty important. It looks at the indirect benefits of flexibility, enabling electrification by getting around bottlenecks, or potentially even shifting load to hours when you have renewables curtailments, so that you're improving the capacity factor of renewables, improving their economics, and leading to more deployment of renewables across the system. Those indirect effects are, I think, relevant. They're pretty hard for us to get into in a study like this, but they are definitely something that we can acknowledge in our broader discussion of the benefits of grid flexibility.
If I can just second something you were saying there, Ryan, in our value of distributed energy resources, or VDER proceeding, we have spent some time attempting to come up with hourly E-values, and that's really not led anywhere fruitful from an analytical perspective, because in areas where there is congestion and air quality issues associated with power, if you're looking at storage, we've had trouble where the charging and discharging times have kind of differing levels of emissions, but looking at the year, we've had trouble getting kind of conclusive price signals that have shown benefits. It's taken some time. It's bogged us down, and again, this is a high level study, and we found that to be a bit of a challenging exercise to layer in. Not to say that there isn't value, but we do have a history of attempting to look in greater detail there, and having challenges proving out benefits. Another point I would like to make about the environmental value is we are looking at sensitivities that include avoided renewable production, which effectively is avoided RECs, and that's the value reflected in the E-value. So it's not entirely left out of this analysis. The environmental value from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, I would argue that would be the abatement costs, which we sometimes use as a proxy for the societal costs.
Thanks, Rai. And okay, so question about CLCPA equity requirements. Will you be analyzing incentives needed for different customer segments, specifically whether low-income customers or people in disadvantaged communities will be able to participate with the supportive incentives?
We're definitely planning on addressing the issue of disadvantaged communities and low-income customers in our report. And in particular, as I think I was describing earlier, we're anticipating that discussion will be more in the kind of qualitative barriers and solutions portion of the study than it will be in the quantitative potential estimate. part of the reason for that is just data limitations. We don't have all of the same data granularity for that specific subsegment of customers that we do for, say, the residential class more broadly. And just to make that example specific, we might have estimates of customer counts that fall into that category, but we don't have robust data across the state by utility on technology ownership and appliance saturations for that customer segment, or even load profiles for that customer segment and how it differs from the residential customer base more broadly. So when it comes to actually thinking about potential and justifiable incentives for that community from a modeling perspective, we're limited in what we can do. But when it comes to the qualitative, more policy level considerations of how will the transition toward a grid that's more dependent on grid flexibility affect those customers from an equity perspective, what might be needed to draw those customers into a program where technology ownership can be expensive, and not every low-income customer is going to own a $50,000 electric vehicle. There are going to be those types of considerations that will be part of the qualitative recommendations in the analysis. And we will use, to the extent that we do have data on those customer segments, we will be pulling it in and just don't have it at the same level of detail as the other customers.
All right, and then I'm gonna read out a couple of questions and then give one combined answer. How will you determine the resource mix in 2030 and 2040 for your modeling? And the other related question is, what COP are you using to predict peaking demand growth from building electrification? The answer to both of those questions is we're not doing any resource mix modeling or load forecasting ourselves in this study. We're using the integration analysis scenarios and basically directly using the resource mix in the policy achievement scenario and the load forecast from that scenario. So basically the COP assumed is going to be whatever was assumed there, and the resource mix that was output from that analysis. Zerai, anything to add on that? And kind of also another related question is why scenario 2, and I'm going to direct that one to you, Zerai.
Yeah, and I think that one was from Bill Acker, who understands the answer very well, I think, when I give the answer, which is that scenario 2 from the integration analysis is a central policy achievement planning scenario that has cascaded into the coordinated grid planning process that we're using, which I referenced earlier, to do our climate planning for transmission and distribution system investments, where we have an ongoing in parallel study occurring right now. So that was really an attempt to be as consistent as possible with the other planning efforts across the state. And so, I think that's why we selected S2 in this case.
All right. Is AMI, which is now widespread, filling in gaps on end-use load shapes? New York, for example, has a lot of apartment dwellers in different sorts of buildings. Then national data is likely to reflect robustly.
I might invite Kate and Nick to weigh in on this. I know that we are using not just New York specific, but New York utility specific load shapes that we've received from the utilities. But Nick, I imagine there's more that you would want to add to that answer.
Yeah, and Kate can jump in too. So I'll say two parts to this. Yeah, in terms of using AMI data, we are getting segment level shapes from utilities. So that's residential, different commercial, or I guess service class shapes, where available. And AMI, given the availability or deployment of AMI at different utilities, it plays a role in kind of roll up to get to those segment level shapes. In terms of the end use load shapes, AMI is not going to provide that granularity. So that's where, and that granularity being, for the actual hourly load shape, what does the heating, heating or water heating contribute in this individual hour. So that's where we're using external data sources. I'd say New York specific from Restock and Comstock, but then we're also factoring in equipment saturations to scale those appropriately depending on the segments and subsegments, customer subsegments and subsegments as well.
I have just an aside here, if there's no more on the data, which is just to address the status of the AMI rollout in New York. At this point, Con Edison, Orange, and Rockland have fully deployed or mostly deployed AMI metering. However, New York State Gas and Electric, Rochester Gas and Electric, and National Grid are still in the midst of deploying AMI. They're expected to have their deployments complete by the end of 2027, and Central Hudson is on a timeline even further behind that. So we still have 4 of the 6 investor-owned utilities that don't have AMI fully deployed. PSEG Long Island or LIPA does also have full deployment of AMI, but just wanted to make that clarification.
Thanks, Rai. Kate, were you going to add something?
Nope. I think the only thing I'll add is we'll definitely address that this would be a great data improvement for a future study once this AMI data is deployed.
Right. So I think we answered a few questions about front of the meter resources and societal costs of pollution and carbon. Is our understanding correct that this process is taking a system-wide forecast and allocating that equally to all feeders? Yeah, I think as to keep this study pretty high level and not have to do a feeder level load forecasting exercise as part of this project, that is the approach we're taking to allocate it equally. How can we request to participate in an interview or present at a future technical conference?
Yeah, I was gonna say that's maybe a process question for DPS.
In the material that we post with this presentation, we'll include an email contact for staff, which I think if you're interested in, getting involved from a, with the interviews for the study, in some level of engagement beyond becoming a stakeholder to the proceeding, which I see my colleague Stephanie McDermott has added some information to the chat here on a link to where you can register as a stakeholder for this proceeding, so you'll start getting email updates about future meetings and filings. I would say if it's not, if you want more engagement than that, I would encourage downloading that material. We'll post staff's email in that, and you can contact us directly.
All right, and I know there's a few questions we haven't answered, but we have about 1 minute left. So should we close it off here? Any closing remarks?
Well, I'll say this is one of the better attended technical conferences we've had. Some participants have dropped off already, but I counted well over 250 attendees near the beginning of the meeting. And based on the volume of questions in the chat, I can feel the interest in engagement. I know our responses to some of your questions may have been disappointing, but I want to stress that this is a high-level study that is designed to generate policy recommendations. We are tremendously thankful for the engagement and the feedback, and we want you to keep it coming. So, like I said, we'll capture all of the written questions in the chat here. We will consider them. We will be hosting additional technical conferences. As Ryan mentioned, we'll schedule the next one to focus on the phase 2 work. But I think we'll look to make sure that we have ample room to answer your questions in those future technical conferences. And we're at the end of the day, we're very excited. We think we have a strong team putting together the work for these phases, and we really are very excited about working with all of the stakeholders in this proceeding to unlock investments in flexible resources. With that, I think we'll end the technical conference. And again, just thank you all for your engagement here.
Thank you.